What the hell was he thinking? Despite the fact that Canada has the second biggest housing bubble in the world, according to Bloomberg, and Vancouver and Toronto are the second and fifth most unaffordable housing markets on planet Earth, according to Demographia, the Liberal media and the Liberal government wants me to stop talking about housing inflation. Well, you know who doesn't want me to stop talking about it? Raj, who is an IT worker from Brampton who has to drive Uber in order to save up over 15 years to make a down payment on the average house in his community. Will the minister tell Raj and other Canadians, do we have a housing bubble, yes or no?
Yes. The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, we have to acknowledge that there has been a rapid and serious rise in the cost of housing across Canada, but we were wise to this fact long before the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, that's why we advanced a national housing strategy beginning 6 years ago, which didn't seem to get the support of the opposition parties at the time. We're going to continue to make the kinds of investments that has already seen 100,000 new units constructed, that has already seen 300,000 new units retrofitted. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to make the kinds of investments that will increase supply and reduce the costs so more Canadians like Raj can enter the housing market in Canada.
Honourable member for Carleton.
No surprise that the finance minister is running away from her record on housing inflation. After all, since she took the job, prices are up by 20%. Since this government took office, they're up 58%, almost $300,000. They really started to rise when the government started to flood financial and mortgage markets with $400 billion of easy money that have raised not only house prices, but land prices. So with the second biggest housing bubble in the world, will the finance minister finally recognize Canada has a housing bubble? Yes or no?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once upon a time, the Conservatives liked to cast themselves as the party of sound economic management. But now they have a finance critic who, as one columnist recently put it, quote, has breezily bent facts past the breaking point, notably by asserting that Canada has run the largest budget deficit in the G20 and that Canada's inflation rate is far higher than all its peers except the U.S. Neither assertion is true, of course, so why should we listen to anything the member for Carleton has to say?
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, the member loves to quote the Liberal state-funded media to defend herself. Well, let's do that. Let's do that. Let me quote the Globe and Mail. The Liberal government is asking Parliament to approve billions in new spending during a brief 4-hour sitting in Ottawa, but is facing questions because it has not released full accounting of how it spent more than $600 billion last year. Mr. Speaker, we don't know how this deficit ranks because they won't release the public accounts. All we know is that they have flooded the economy with over $500 billion of deficit spending, driving up, for example, housing prices to the second highest in the world. So I will go back to the same question. Does Canada have a housing bubble, yes or no?
Yeah. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the Conservatives' truth problem starts at the top. After all, a recent press conference by the Leader of the Opposition was littered with misleading statements about the economy. I won't get through all of them, but I'll start. He said Canada has the lowest growth. The truth? Q3 GDP numbers show our economy is growing faster than the US, UK, Japan, and Australia. He said Canada has the worst record on employment. The truth? We have recovered over 106% of jobs lost since the pandemic, compared to just 83% in the US. I could go on, Mr. Speaker, but I've run out of time.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, I wish she would, because she loves to quote Liberal media commentators. One of the articles she quoted earlier actually talked about how she put manipulative media onto Twitter, making history as the first minister in Canadian history to be sanctioned by social media companies for misinformation online. So enough with the misinformation.
The question concerned the price of housing. Mr. Speaker, we have the second largest housing bubble in the world. According to Bloomberg, will the minister recognize, yes or no, that there is a housing bubble in Canada?
We need Minister.
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Speaker, it turns out it's not just the member for Carleton or the leader of the opposition who has a truth problem. Last week, the member for Kootenay, Columbia, claimed that we are experiencing hyperinflation. But, Mr. Speaker, hyperinflation happens when inflation hits 50% a month. Mr. Speaker, the member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex claimed we are experiencing stagnation. But, Mr. Speaker, in the third quarter, our economy grew by 5.4% a month. Yet again, the Conservatives are showing Canadians they just can't be taken seriously on the economy.
Mr. Speaker, do you know how many buildings the federal government owns? 37,246. Wow. Do you know how much land the federal government owns? Almost 41 million hectares. Wow. Now, Conservatives had a plan in the last election. It was to tie infrastructure dollars to housing prices. The Liberals' plan, create more housing inflation. Can the minister tell us how a 20% rise in housing prices is actually helping Canadians?
The Honourable Minister.
Every Canadian deserves a safe and affordable place to call home. And with respect to the honourable member's question, I'd point out that that's precisely why our government brought in the National Housing Strategy, which has seen more than $72 billion planned to help ensure Canadians get the housing that they need. Since 2015, in just the past 6 years, Mr. Speaker, our government supported the creation of nearly 100,000 new units and have repaired over 300,000 more across all housing programs, representing $27.4 billion. There is no shortage of investments we've made, Mr. Speaker, to make sure Canadians have a place they can afford that is safe to call home.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Unreal, Mr. Speaker. Does that member not realize that in downtown Toronto, the average home price of a single detached family home is $1.8 million? Well, let's compare Canada with the rest of the G7. Building housing supply, the highest or the lowest. So, Mr. Speaker, housing inflation, the highest. New builds, down 5.2%. House prices up 20%. Under what metric in the world is this plan working?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
It's hard to point out which metric he's pointing to when we're confused about which is higher and which is lower, Mr. Speaker. But with great respect, what's not wavered is our commitment to ensuring that we're investing in building supply, investing in programs like a new rent-to-own so people who are renting can actually afford a place to call home, which will have generational impacts. Investments that are actually going to make homes more affordable for first-time buyers. Mr. Speaker, whether it's housing affordability or building more affordable housing, our government has been committed like no other government in the history of Canada from the very moment we first formed government, and that's not going to continue, not going to cease, Mr. Speaker. We know it's a problem, and we're going to continue to address it.
The Honourable